Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our AJA Zoom session. Just before we get into it, I do want to welcome listeners via J-Air, the Jewish community radio station in Melbourne. What we're doing tonight is simulcasting our Zoom session through the J-Air radio station. So if you're in the car or listening on radio, you will be able to hear what's going on. And as it turns out, these Zoom sessions of ours, I think, will translate very nicely to a radio setting, as we often don't have visuals. So welcome to all the J-Air listeners. We hope you enjoy it, and this is going to be a regular feature. Tonight's just a test run, but we do hope to make it regular. Okay, my name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am again your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens, David Adler, President of the AJA, and our special guest for tonight, Colonel Richard Kemp, who we will formally introduce in a moment. Our format will be as usual. David is going to chat with Richard for about 30-35 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions from the audience. Now, if you want to ask a question, the way to get our attention is to click the raise hand image, which is in the reaction icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click that, we get a signal, and then you go into the queue for asking questions. The chat function is available as usual, but we do ask you to keep to the topic and not wander off. And just a reminder for those that may not be familiar, in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you've got a little icon which says View, and you can choose to either have a gallery view or a speaker view, and if you click between the two, you'll get to see what they do and find out which is most comfortable for you. Now, I'm sure Colonel Richard Kemp will need very little introduction to this audience. He is a retired British Army officer who served from 1977 to 2006, where he spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front line of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. Most of the last 5 years of Richard's military career were spent in Downing Street as head of the international terrorism team at the Joint Intelligence Committee, where he was responsible for producing assessments on the growing global terrorist problem for the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Of most interest to us is his knowledge and expertise regarding Afghanistan and his views on the events of the last few weeks. We're delighted to have him with us tonight. Colonel Richard Kemp, welcome back to Australia via the AJA, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to join you, Alan. I'm very grateful for you asking me. I'm only just looking forward to the next time I can come and join you in person, which I hope won't be before too long.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you in person. I'll hand over to David. So, David, you can kick off the discussion.
Okay. Well, Richard, thank you very much for making your time available at short notice, and we're delighted to be able to talk to you because, as everyone knows, there have been very, very significant events in the region. Now, you've been critical of the way that the US has disengaged. How big a problem is it?
I think it's an enormous strategic problem that will affect the world, not just today, but long into the future in a very bad way from the West's point of view. Its consequences, I would say, are almost incalculable. And wow. We have to just look at a number of, I'll just briefly look at a number of different aspects of the effects of this catastrophe, as I would describe it. And first of all, I mean, we can't forget the fate that is befalling the people of Afghanistan, the night that's descending over that country now with the ruthless, vicious murderers, rapists, torturers, and bestial people in the Taliban who ruled the country for a number of years before 2001. And we know from the regime that they inflicted then, we know what it's going to be like now. And despite their fine words about equality and diversity and all the other stuff they've been talking, they are going to run the place. And we've already been seeing many signs of it. They're going to run the place exactly as they ran it before. perhaps with a slightly different approach in terms of public relations. They've learned a bit about PR, and that's, I think, the main thing they have learned. But the reality is it's going to be brutal and oppressive, and I think we can all feel sorry for anyone who's in Afghanistan now. But that's kind of focused on the country alone. The effects are much bigger. The first other major effect is in the geostrategic area, and President Biden said that one of the reasons he was pulling out of Afghanistan completely was in order to focus resources against China and Russia, which obviously confront us increasingly every day, particularly China. And he was right to think about focusing on those two authoritarian regimes. But the effect of pulling out the relatively small number of US forces that were deployed there, costing a relatively small amount of money as well, the effect of pulling them out is going to be the opposite of what he said. One of the main parts of our strategy in confronting China and Russia is to put up a united front in the democratic world, including, of course, Australia, in which we try and, shall we say, entice third countries which are not currently in the democratic sphere of influence, but are maybe looking towards working with becoming part of the Chinese sphere of influence or the Russian sphere, persuading them to join us and persuading them of the strength of democratic values and Western values. And of course, they're going to look at this situation and say, well, the West and the US in particular are fair weather allies. We can't trust them when the going gets tough, and we won't trust them, and we're more likely to be able to trust Russia and China as allies. So we won't be working with these fair weather friends. And I think that's going to be a major problem. And also the extent to which this will embolden Russia and China. They already push the envelope as far as they can in their dealings with our various countries. And I'm well aware of the confrontations that have occurred recently between Australia and China. And I think that will it will embolden them to push even further. And then the other kind of major two elements that we face, one which I think most people are well aware of, which is the problems of mass immigration from Afghanistan, refugees flooding around different parts of the world, in the region and into the West. And finally, the terrorist threat, which is perhaps, I think, the most directly significant for our countries, which is going to become, which effectively is, as now, is the greatest, I think, terrorist threat we have faced since 2001.
That's a very dark picture. Richard, would you have, if you were advising the US, would you have advised them not to withdraw at all, or would you have taken more of the approach that former President Trump has articulated, namely that yes, the US had to pull out eventually, but that Biden had it all round the wrong way? I'm sure you've seen some of the statements from President Trump, who's basically said the last thing you do is you pull out your military personnel. First, you pull out all the people that you need to, you deal with the equipment, etc. So it sounds like you have a different perspective.
Well, my view is we should not have pulled out.
Right.
And I can understand why many people disagree with that, including both President Trump and President Biden. But the reality is we went into Afghanistan for one purpose and one purpose only. It was not to turn Afghanistan into Melbourne or Sydney or even Surrey in England. It was not to institute democracy in this country, which has never known such a thing. It was not to improve women's rights or anyone's human rights. It was to counter terrorism. It was to deal with the people who perpetrated 9/11, Al-Qaeda, with the support of the Taliban, which of course was the greatest terrorist atrocity in the history of the world. And in fact, from Britain's perspective, more British people were killed in that attack than have ever been killed in any other single terrorist attack in history. So the purpose was to prevent anything like that happening again, to get rid of the people that did it and stop Afghanistan from again becoming a safe haven for terrorism, which it certainly would have done had we not entered and dealt with the situation. So that was the reason. Now, some people would argue we should have gone straight in, dealt with it, come straight out. That, of course, would have left a vacuum, which would have been filled again by the same people as filled it before. And we're back to square one after maybe taking a few casualties in the process. So we really had, I think, to stay there for a bit and try and establish some framework for enabling the people of Afghanistan to prevent this happening again from their country. Now, I think everyone can argue, and I'm sure nobody but really is in hindsight thinks that we did the right thing over 20 years. I don't think we did either. But I think we should have remained there until we could have solved the problem. The problem is not solved now. And while President Biden says, he made a speech the other day, I have ended the war in Afghanistan. He has not ended the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is still raging. He has merely pulled US forces out of Afghanistan, and with them, all of the other Western forces which had to follow. So I think, we should have maintained a footprint along the similar lines as we had there up until August or before August, and done everything we could to contain that problem. I believe that now, having left, which maybe we'll talk about in a bit, the problem will manifest itself much more. But if we did have to leave Afghanistan, and if that was, it was the decision, we did it in the wrong way. We did it the opposite of the way it should have been done. The first point I'd make is that President Biden gave the Afghan people very little time to prepare for a very, very new and different situation, and to get ready to face it and get the forces ready to face it. That's something that could have taken maybe a couple of years, certainly more than a couple of months since his decision. The Afghan government didn't really believe it was going to happen. They were in a state of denial. That should have been alleviated, shall we say, by US persuasion and diplomacy and a longer period. So that's the first point, I think. And that's one of the reasons why the government and the forces collapsed so quickly. The second thing I think I would have done differently is I would not have withdrawn at the height of the Taliban fighting season. They fight hardest and with the greatest strength during the late spring, the summer, and the early autumn. And that's exactly when we pulled out. Instead of leaving it, let's say, until late autumn or winter, when the Taliban tend to be less active, less vigorous, and their fighters tend to sort of go undercover for a bit, we would not have seen the strength of attack that we saw in the Taliban had it occurred at a different time of year. And I think the third thing I would have done very differently would have been, I would not have pulled out pretty much all of my armed forces before I'd managed to evacuate the civilian population there that we need to, our national civilians, as well as those locals who we depended upon during the war, interpreters and so on.
That's one of the great tragedies, Richard, that people who have taken risk to help the US forces and others, I don't know how many are stuck there, but it's probably a few thousand in total, interpreters and, suppliers of various sorts, caterers, whatever. It's shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you totally. And without those people, we could not have operated. Australian forces could not have operated. British forces could not have operated in that country particularly without interpreters, but also other locals as well. And those people, of course, now are right at the top of the list of the Taliban to eliminate or to imprison or to punish in some other way, severely punish. And of course, they are effectively hostages today. They're hostages of the Taliban. The Taliban know we want them out, and if they decide they're going to allow any of them out, then they will extract a very, very heavy price from us to do so.
Shocking. The other thing that was left behind, and we've seen on social media and such, schedules of the military equipment, and President Trump just in the last 24 hours has confirmed some of the estimates going around that it could have been $85 billion worth. How serious is that the equipment was left? Can the Taliban use it, perhaps with the help of Pakistani or other expertise? How much damage can be done with the equipment that's been left behind?
I think that there's an eye-watering quantity of military weapons and equipment of various different sorts in Afghanistan. I did see one statistic, for example, that said that the Taliban now have more helicopters than the entire British Armed Forces have. And they have more Black Hawk helicopters than every other country in the world combined, apart from the United States. That's just one kind of statistic. There are many other ones which are equally concerning. They're now, I think, pretty much the heaviest armed terrorist group in the world, possibly with the exception of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria. But they will make use of this equipment for their own internal purposes in Afghanistan, for oppressing and dealing with any opposition that they face. Potentially, they will use it for terrorist attacks outside the country. Some of this equipment, they will certainly sell some of it to other terrorist groups, maybe in Pakistan, other parts of the region, and they will potentially some of the more sophisticated equipment. They won't necessarily be able to use all of the sophisticated equipment, like some of the helicopters, some of the surveillance equipment, sensors, etc. They might not be able to use those, although there are quite a few Afghan soldiers who are trained on this equipment have defected to the Taliban and could use it, but it's a question also of very complicated technical maintenance. So it may be more likely some of that equipment will be transferred to countries like Pakistan, Russia, China, etc. I don't think there's a huge concern about, I mean, there is some concern about reverse engineering some of this equipment so that it can be used to either attack us in the future or to counter our systems, which are of a similar nature. But I don't think that's a massive concern. I don't think a lot of the equipment was quite of that nature, but it's still hugely worrying that all this equipment was left there. But on the other hand, it was hard to see how you could not leave it there, because this was equipment that was given to the Afghan National Security Forces, and to have deprived them of it, to have confiscated it as we were pulling out, would have been an even worse situation than the one we encountered, I think. But nevertheless, I think once we consider the situation in Afghanistan is settled, in other words, we've got all those people out we think we can get out, then I think we should take action to locate, identify the mass concentration of equipment and carry out strikes to destroy it.
Particularly the aircraft, I guess, the more lethal elements. Yeah. Richard, I want to ask now your views on the impact of this beyond the borders of Afghanistan. Some commentators have said that the victory of the Taliban, and it's being painted as a victory, will inspire Sunni extremists elsewhere, perhaps in Europe, the UK, US, Australia, wherever these groups exist. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I do. And I'm the head of MI5 here in Britain, which is, I guess, the equivalent of ASIO in Australia. He's responsible for all counter-terrorism in the UK, or takes the lead on it. He said a couple of days ago that exactly what you said, that it will inspire them. And of course, he's right, because the victory by the Taliban in Afghanistan is the greatest victory for jihadists in modern times. And I think, the only comparable victory you could, I think, identify with jihadists is in 1979, when the Shia jihadists took over Iran and turned Iran into a terrorist state. Well, we now have a Sunni terrorist state in Afghanistan taken over by the Taliban, and the scale of that victory is. It's almost incalculable in terms of the extent to which it will inspire jihadists everywhere. It will inspire jihadists in Australia, in Britain, in other parts of Europe, in the US, to carry out attacks. Those people already here will receive much more funding as a result of this. They'll be able to attract greater donors as a result of the Taliban's victory. They will get more recruits. They will be re-energized to carry out attacks. And that might be possibly bomb attacks, stabbing, ramming attacks, all the kind of thing we saw when, particularly around the time when Islamic State was at its height, and were also inspiring this kind of attack. So that's a major danger that I think we will face today in all of our countries. And the longer term terrorist threat is even greater than that, because, as I mentioned, the problem from international terrorism in Afghanistan has not gone away. It's now been effectively reinserted, and the Taliban claim that they have no, they won't allow terrorist attacks from Afghanistan to take place against the West. I go back to the point I made before. They're good at PR now, or better at PR. So that's the message they want us to hear. It certainly isn't the truth. The Taliban were, before 2001, were focused predominantly on internal affairs inside Afghanistan. Today, they have a lot of newer members. They've been fighting the West for 20 years. They've had a victory against the West. Some of them have been guests inside Guantanamo Bay. They're now much more externally focused. And even some of their statements recently have reflected the fact that they want jihad spread around the world. And so they will be looking outwards as well. They will be looking to launch attacks against us at the time they choose. They will also allow Al-Qaeda, which they've got a very close relationship with, closer now than it was in 2001. They will allow them to set up bases and to operate from there. There's a strong presence already. President Biden makes the pretense that we and the Taliban will be fighting against the Islamic State together, which isn't true. That he calls the Islamic State the sworn enemies of the Taliban. They're not. They sometimes hate each other, they sometimes kill each other, but sometimes they cooperate. And they will certainly be prepared to cooperate in attacks against the West in the future. I think that's, that the narrative of the Taliban are the good terrorists is purely a constructed narrative put in place in order to try and diminish the political damage that's been done to President Biden and also to our own leaders, including the Prime Minister here in the UK, who can't be without blame for some of this action. So I think the net effect of all this is that we will see a very, very significantly growing terrorist threat from Afghanistan, immediately inspired by what's happened in Afghanistan. In the longer term, plots being launched from Afghanistan. And I just hope our security services in our respective countries are able to step up and prevent them from happening.
Do you think the Taliban will be interested in training people now that they've got territory, military bases, equipment, training cells in order to send them out, or are they going to be more focused on just gaining control of the country?
I would say the Taliban's direct priorities will be to control the country, but that doesn't preclude future terrorist attacks being planned by them and launched by them outside Afghanistan, including in Pakistan. And I think the people who are likely to be most involved in training and preparing attacks in the immediate future are the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And we will see jihadists again flocking into Afghanistan as they did before 9/11, flocking into Afghanistan to meet, to train, to prepare, to plan, and to carry out attacks against the West. It was the hub of international terrorism before 9/11. It is again today now. And I did mention Pakistan just then. I should say Pakistan was the main backers of the Taliban. They deny it, of course, but they were. And without Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, the Taliban could not have been as strong as they were. They could not have achieved the victory they've just achieved. But nevertheless, Pakistan also faces its own internal insurgency to bring down the government, a jihadist insurgency as well. And I think, one of the greatest concerns of Western intelligence agencies over the years since 9/11 has been that the lack of US Western presence in Afghanistan, the strength of the jihad in Afghanistan, particularly if the Taliban took over again, is likely to destabilize Pakistan even further, to encourage the jihad there, to support the jihad there, and maybe to lead to the worst possible scenario, which would be jihadists in Pakistan or from outside Pakistan gaining possession of nuclear materials or nuclear weapons from Pakistan.
Richard, I'd like to now look at any flow-on effects that you think might be relevant to Israel. We know that the Taliban have said that they would be happy to have some sort of relationship with every country on the planet except for Israel, which suggests that they do have, I don't know if it's just diplomatic or something else, they've got Israel in their sights to a degree. What's your view on the change, if any, in threat to Israel?
I think that statement they made about Israel is a badge of honor for Israel, to be honest with you. It may not be comfortable, but nevertheless, I think it again illustrates the close relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, because of course Israel was very high in every single statement Al-Qaeda has ever made about attacks on the West. Israel's always featured at the top of their sort of list and their rationale. So I think there's no doubt there is a major impact of this on Israel. I think the first is, I'll just run through as briefly as I can a couple of things I think that are relevant. The first one is that Israel has a policy, a long-standing policy of defending itself by itself. Yes, of course, it depends on Western support in technology terms, in intelligence terms, and also particularly from the US in terms of financial support for its military hardware. But despite that, they've never asked, and I think never will ask, any other country to use their forces to defend them. And I believe this debacle in Afghanistan proves the wisdom of that policy. If you recall, back in, I think it was something like 2014 or 15, around about then, it may not be in the exact dates, but President Obama and John Kerry put forward a peace plan for Israel, and part of that plan was that the IDF would pull out of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria in order to allow the Palestinians to have a sovereign state. And that plan, which was drawn up by US General John Allen, a very distinguished US Marine Corps general, included, once the IDF had come out, US forces replacing them. Now, all we have to do is look at what's happened in Afghanistan to see how long that might last. The first time the US started taking casualties in that situation, and they would, there's no doubt about it, because jihadists in Judea and Samaria and who influence activity there know very well what the consequences are of inflicting US casualties. How long would they remain there? How long are US, particularly under an administration like the Biden administration, how many Americans are going to say, yeah, we're happy for American soldiers to come back in body bags defending Israel? I don't think so. Some, of course, would, but anyway, I think that plan was roundly rejected by many of us, including, of course, the Israeli government, thankfully. And it could never have worked. And there's another sort of link to that. There was a time when Secretary of State Kerry suggested to Prime Minister Netanyahu that he go to Afghanistan to look at the massive success the US has had with training Afghan locals to be security forces. And this could be the model for training the Palestinian security forces. Netanyahu had the good sense to decline that. And I think this latest situation has shown his wisdom in doing that. But more currently, I would say, Iran obviously is the #1 enemy of Israel. We all know that. And in particular, Iran's regional aggression and Iran's desire to gain an increasing action towards gaining its own nuclear weapons program. There had been a hope, I think, that, maybe a false hope, I don't know, but there've been quite a lot of protests in recent years in Iran, particularly recent months actually in Iran, which some had hoped might lead eventually to the fall of the government in Tehran, which would be obviously a very good thing, I believe. Those people who were planning to rise up against the government in Tehran, or thinking about doing so, were obviously expecting that they would have US support were they to do so. Now they will not be thinking that, and the prospects of overturning the Ayatollahs in Tehran has gone a lot further away from us now. So that prospect is much less, which makes Iran continuing to be a terrorist state. Iran has been emboldened by this. There's no question. Iranian regional aggression, which has been growing, is now going to grow even further because they have no fears of US intervention now after Afghanistan. Of course, Iran itself has also gained some influence in Afghanistan. Iran helped fund the Taliban. They armed the Taliban. They gave safe haven to the Taliban. They paid Taliban fighters to kill American and British troops in Afghanistan. They used weapons, the Taliban used weapons and munitions supplied by Iran to kill our troops in Afghanistan. They weren't the biggest player, Pakistan were, but Iran played a significant role over many years in this. So they will be cashing in their chips and will have some influence over the Taliban. But at the same time, they also do have concerns about the potential for terrorism spreading from Afghanistan into their own country. And of course, there's a major drugs concern with drugs being trafficked from Afghanistan into Iran. But the net effect, I think, is that Iran is strengthened by this. And the final point, apart from the general, as I mentioned before, the general inspiration of jihadists around the world, I think the final point I'd make about Israel is that that I'm sure everyone listening is more aware than I am probably of the delicate balance between in relations between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and I think none of us, I don't believe, are under any illusions about how how good the Palestinian Authority or Fatah are. We know that they're not on the side of Israel. We know that they want to bring Israel down in the same way as Hamas do, but they have different methods, and they have a kind of a tactical means of cooperating to an extent with Israel, which is useful at the moment. So I think in Israel's interests, it's more in Israel's interest for the Palestinian Authority to be stronger and the Hamas weaker. We know that the recent conflict in Gaza in May turned that around a bit and gave Hamas greater strength and greater power than it had before, unfortunately. This does the same thing. This situation, I think, hugely inflates and increases Hamas's strength. Hamas have close relations with the Taliban. They will be strengthened and inspired. And those people who might otherwise be inclined to support the PA or to oppose Hamas are now, many of them are going to be on the side of Hamas because they see it. Let me just read a couple of very brief statements which are relevant to this. First one is from Hamas. It says, they were the first, by the way, Hamas were the first people to congratulate the Taliban on their victory. And they said, we congratulate the Muslim Afghan people for the defeat of the American occupation and the Taliban movement and its brave leadership in this victory, which culminated its long struggle over the past 20 years. The demise of the American occupation and its allies proved that the resistance of the peoples, foremost of which is our struggling Palestinian people, will achieve victory. That speaks very loud.
Yes,
and
they're trying to align the motivation. They're trying to align the motivation there, clearly.
Absolutely, and they are very well aligned. They share the same ideology. They share the same aspirations, and to an extent, international aspirations as well. Then the Palestinian Authority, the good guys, shall we say, for want of a better word, and I can think of many other words to describe them. They issued a statement which said, basically compared the US withdrawal to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They said Israel must absorb the lesson. External protection does not bring security and peace to any country. The Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land will not last and will end. So again, we see the Palestinian Authority there recognizing what kind of an effect the Taliban victory will have, and themselves trying to take some advantage of it and trying to appease the Taliban.
Rich, look, thank you so much. What you've described is almost like throwing a stone into a pond, and these ripples keep going out and out and out, having different effects. I'd like to hand to Alan now to invite questions, and I can see that we've got quite a few lined up.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Yes, we will go to questions in a moment. Just before we do, I do want to slip one of mine in. Richard, the Taliban say they have progressed as a political body. What's your assessment of that? And whether they have or they haven't, how do you think that organisations such as the EU or the UN will approach this attempt at normalisation? Will they treat the Taliban as a legitimate entity?
I think they would love to. I think particularly the EU and the UN would love to look upon the Taliban as a normal normal government, and they will when they get the chance to do so. Unfortunately, the Taliban has, despite, as I mentioned before, their fine words early on, they've shown exactly what they are. The new government in Kabul, the new government that was announced a few days ago in Kabul, is hardline, old school Taliban. There's nothing diverse about them, which they claim. There's no, there's very little representation apart from within the old school Taliban, within Pashtun. Very little representation from any of the other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, virtually none. The leader of the government is the Prime Minister is sanctioned by the United Nations for destabilizing and security concerns. Therefore, someone who's sanctioned by the United Nations, very, very difficult to know how you can deal with somebody like that as any government. So that will be a problem. And then many of the others are on various different watch lists and wanted lists. One, I think the Ministry of the Interior is on the FBI's top wanted men's list. And there they are. And so I think it's going to pose a problem. I think some countries will no doubt recognize them as soon as they can. Pakistan obviously is very keen on rallying support for the Taliban government in Afghanistan and has been recently holding conferences in the region for regional countries like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and other countries, Stans and Iran and others, to try and rally support for the Taliban. So I think there will be an element of that. I'm pretty confident that that China, China's already promised some aid to Afghanistan, not very much, but I'm sure China will become the major international influence over Afghanistan in the future. It will be looking to plunder Afghanistan's resources, and it will also be looking to put in, probably, if it can be sure that there's going to be some kind of stability in the country, which it might help to impose, then it will be making massive investment there in as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, and it's territorial. It's extremely valuable because it links China to Pakistan directly, and so I think we'll see a massive influence from China. China, of course, has been supporting the Taliban for many years, as I mentioned with Iran. And just one example of the Chinese relationship with the Taliban. This may be unbelievable to some people, but the China has been paying the Sunni Taliban to track down and murder Sunni Uyghurs from China who've been escaping into Afghanistan in some cases. So that just shows you the kind of very, very difficult to understand logic that goes on in some of these countries. So I think the answer is, the EU, etc., will be looking to do so, but it will take a bit of time, I think, before they can.
Thank you. Now we'll go to questions. The first three that I have lined up are Michael, Barry and Dennis. Just before we do, I want to mention that if you're listening to us on JA Radio, this is an AJA Zoom session, which is being simulcast, so welcome to you. And before we go to questions, I'll ask David to just, for 30 seconds, tell us what's coming up next week, and we'll do this now rather than at the end of the session. David?
Okay, Alan, you took me by surprise there. We're taking a break until the 6th of October when we recommence our weekly Wednesday events. And 6th of October, we have a very special guest. I'm sure many of you will have heard about the Palestinian Media Watch, and we have the director of Palestinian Media Watch, Itamar Marcus. They do incredible work, joining us on the 6th of October.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, so now questions from you. So Michael, you were first, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Fine, Michael.
Michael, are you there? Are people able to unmute themselves, David?
Oh, there, that Michael. Okay, got him.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay, Richard, the world's changed quite a lot since you and I sat down at the beautiful Royce Hotel in the lobby and had a chat for Nothing Left Radio.
I remember that very well, Michael, and I'm looking forward to my next sojourn in the Royce Hotel.
Yes, I'm sure you are. Look, just thinking outside the square, Richard, do you think in the light of Biden's Afghan failure, he will look for other ways to succeed in the Middle East and will start some sort of new peace initiative between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Do you think that will be a strategic move of his?
Well, I think very clearly he will be looking to salvage some of his completely lost reputation, if he had a reputation for foreign affairs in the past, which I think some people might question. He will be certainly looking for initiatives to salvage that. I'm not sure he will go down the route of trying yet another so-called peace initiative, because I think, I guess anyway, his advisors will recognize that that's going to be something he will not be able to achieve, and so it might possibly result in another failed foreign policy initiative for President Biden. But we don't know. I mean, I wouldn't claim that the current White House is necessarily rational in their behavior. I do think President Biden's calculation over Afghanistan was that this would, he would be able to stand up, as he has done, and say, I have ended the never-ending wars. I've pulled all the troops back from Afghanistan, and this will be a massive boost for the midterm elections and for the next presidential elections. That was his calculation. A very cynical calculation, in my view, when you're considering, people's lives and deaths, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world, including the US. But nevertheless, that was his calculation. And I think some people, and I'm not a great expert on US politics, but I tend to agree with this as well. I think some people will recognise that the fallout from this has been massive, and it will be hugely damaging in the short term. But there's a good chance it will be forgotten about by the midterms, which is only next year, by much of the US public and certainly the media in the US, much of it. And will be a boost for him in the midterms. So, I think if that's the calculation, there's less imperative, I would say, to embark on what, would be seen as an almost certain failure of a putative peace process. But I do think that the current administration will be desperate, even more desperate than they were before, to try and get the Iran nuclear deal back on tracks. And we've already seen signs of that in recent days. And that would be, I think, an immediate boost for Biden in terms of his supporters, who obviously are misled about the reality of the nuclear deal.
Thank you. Barry, you're next, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Richard, for a very informative talk. I followed your commentary with great interest, particularly in that great film, Whose Land, by my good friend Hugh Kitson. We're well aware of the perilous situation those that are left in Afghanistan that are American citizens or sympathizers. But what can you tell us about the Jewish and Christian population in Afghanistan? I'm not sure of the Jewish presence there, but I understand the Christian one is quite considerable. Have you got any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think sorry, Barry, I'm glad you mentioned the great Hugh Kitson, the great filmmaker. And I would strongly recommend his film, which I do play a minor role in, called Whose Land, which is, I believe, is quite educational about the history and the current day, land rights in Israel. Anyway, that small commercial break aside, I think the Christians in Afghanistan are. I do know that, I don't know if there's a Jewish community in Afghanistan, but I do know there is at least one Jew there, because I'm in communications with him. But I'm sure there are others. But I think the Christian population, and no doubt the Jewish population, whatever it is there, is very much at risk from the Taliban, as indeed the Christian population is in every other part of that region and much of the rest of the world, Africa and the Middle East, etc. So I'm not aware of any focus so far specifically on Christians, but no doubt they will be taking cover, as many other people, including all the women in Afghanistan, are taking cover now from the Taliban.
Yes, it's very sobering. Okay, next up is Dennis, and then we've got Robert and Ron. Dennis, please unmute yourself.
Just while Dennis is preparing his question, I'll say that Afghanistan did have one Jewish man, and he's been pulled out by some American sponsors. So as of today, the number of Jews in America is exactly, in Afghanistan is exactly 0.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, Dennis, fire away.
Okay, 2 very quick questions. US withdrawal from of military involvement is not only in Afghanistan, but seems to be occurring in other parts of the world or threatened in other parts of the world where the US has had a presence, including in Syria. And I'm just wondering, do you see that there is, as a consequence, a more inward-looking America, less focused on the rest of the world and being, in a sense, a policeman for the world? And that obviously then has a consequence for smaller countries like Australia and like Israel, who have been staunch allies and have been expected to participate with the US. Is this withdrawal now going to be more symptomatic of the American politics of the future under the Biden administration? That's number one. Number two, very quickly, I've seen videos of truckloads of equipment, of US military equipment going across the border into Iran. I don't know if you're aware of that. Will the Iranians learn anything from this equipment which will make them more volatile and more dangerous in the future?
I think in terms of being the world's policeman, President Biden claims that he is looking more to the, to kind of confront the Chinese and the Russian threats, rather than dealing with what he's described as the never-ending wars, and is I think, as a standing policy, is keen to be pulling out of those countries that he doesn't think it's necessary to have an influence. Unfortunately, when it comes particularly to jihadism, not particularly to jihadism, in this case to jihadism, you don't necessarily choose the wars you have to fight. You either are prepared to stand up and fight against an enemy that threatens you or your interests or your allies, or else you're not. And in this case, very clearly, they're not. The Biden administration is not. And I think it does signify a kind of concern that every other country around the world that had relied on the US in the past should have now with this administration. I'm not saying for a moment that whatever subsequent administration there is wouldn't reverse these policies, but it is concerning for the time being, at least. And I think, one example of that is Taiwan, which clearly is in the sights of China, increasingly in the sights of China, and had hoped that the US would protect it from China when the time came. And I think, we've seen recent comments by the Taiwanese government about their need to be less reliant on the US now for obvious reasons. So I think it's deeply concerning for any country in the world that had been looking for US protection. And as I mentioned before, for those countries that we had hoped would sort of join us in the Western sphere rather than being allied to China and Russia or Russia. So I think it's a big danger, and I think it's not just the US either. I mean, the UK obviously is a much smaller country with much less global influence than the US, but nevertheless, the UK is still a significant country in the world with a lot of global reach, and it's still, despite the many cuts over the years, still has some military power left. And I think that the UK also will be probably trying to follow America into a kind of more inward-looking perspective. The UK, and I'm sure this applies equally to the US, but the UK has been deeply traumatized by its experience in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Syria and Libya in recent years, in particular Afghanistan and Iraq. And I believe that the political leaders here, Johnson and the Foreign Secretary and others, and pretty much all of the leadership, were despite their protests about leaving Afghanistan, were very pleased when America did. And, you know, they claimed they wanted to stay, and they tried to put together a NATO coalition, but no other NATO member would agree to it. I don't believe that's true. I don't doubt they tried, but they would have tried knowing that there would be no positive response from a NATO country. And that again calls into question the veracity, the credibility of NATO as an organization, which is an extremely important one. On the point of munitions being moved from Afghanistan into Iran, I didn't actually see that footage, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I'd have been surprised if they hadn't transferred some of it to Iran. I don't suppose that it will make a great deal of technological difference to Iran, because, as I mentioned before, I don't think the technological sophistication of some of this equipment is, includes things that that countries like Iran, Russia, China, etc., don't already have. But it could, obviously, anything like that. If China's buying it, then it's going to be useful for something to them, and that may be for equipping some of their proxies, or it may be for their own use. We would, whether it's externally or internal.
Thank you. Okay, Robert, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, I think that history shows that when powers are involved, especially the great powers are involved with various world affairs, they do things which suit themselves. So when America pulled out, it suited itself, and I've got to remember that Trump was also going to pull out as well. The real problem is that once countries decide they will or they will not do something, what actions does it leave for those other countries in the area which don't have the massive clout of the United States or Russia or China, countries like Australia or Taiwan or Singapore, small countries which may feel a very detrimental effect from the terrible regime that is in Afghanistan now, and it is represented by the Afghani threat.
I share your concern entirely, and I think all of us these days have to, and for many years have grown accustomed to depending on superpowers, effectively. In our case, in your case, the United States of America, as well as each other. And I think that one of the kind of problems of the American perspective at the moment, or the perspective on America at the moment, is in the Middle East, where I mentioned some of the concerns, but another one is that, of course, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other states that have depended very heavily on US protection against Iran are now very, very worried about this. And they will be turning more to Israel than they even than they've done in the past, and that's been very significant. But they will be turning, I think, more to Israel for protection against Iran, which is obviously, in some respects, a positive thing for Israel. But on the other hand, also there's an increasing look by some countries at Russia, at China, some countries in the Middle East, to become their basically guarantors in the place of the United States. That is the opposite of what we want to achieve. And of course, it does apply to countries outside that region as well, who, as I mentioned a couple of times, are maybe going to be looking more for the protection and support of China than of the United States, which is a terrible thing. And I think, I go back to the point I made before about NATO, for example, and other international treaty organizations, how important they are. And the relationship, or their credibility has been sunk, NATO's credibility has been sunk by this, and that needs to be rebuilt, because obviously, the US is the key thing in NATO. We knew that for many years, but now it looks as if the US was the only thing in NATO, because no other NATO country was prepared to club together and try and maintain some kind of presence, even in the short term, in Afghanistan, in the absence of the US.
Yes. Okay, Ron, please unmute yourself and ask your question, and then Terry. Ron, are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And good evening, and thank you for your service, Richard. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask you, the conventional wisdom in the last few years was that Shia and Sunni hatred that goes over centuries was that they could never cooperate with each other. And I'm just wondering if you think that a relationship between the Taliban and Hezbollah could last beyond a honeymoon period.
Yeah, I think I would say that idea that Sunni and Shia would never cooperate with each other is a fallacy. Of course, they fought against each other for centuries, but we've got ample evidence over many years of the opposite. And we just have to look at the relationship between, for example, between Iran and Hamas. You know, Hamas are Sunni terrorists and Iran are Shia terrorists, and you know, the cooperation is very, very close. The same applies in many different, you know, between many different terrorist groups in the world. I mentioned Iran and the Taliban, for example. And as to Hezbollah and Hamas, they've been cooperating for decades now. It's not a honeymoon period. They've been cooperating together for decades. And I can remember a time when I was working in British intelligence when, you know, we were seeing that if Hamas ever thought about slightly shirking their responsibilities, let's say they were a bit, you know, run down after working very hard against Israel, then the people that would sort them out would be Hezbollah. They'd go down there, re-encourage them, energize them, give them a kick when necessary, and bring them back on track. So I think, you know, I think this corporate, while the kind of the mutual enemy of it, in the case of Iran and of Hamas and Hezbollah in particular, Israel, while that mutual enemy exists, then cooperation will exist between the two.
Okay, I think Terry will make you the final question if you can be very brief. Apologies to Reuven and Joseph. Terry, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. It's a very interesting strategic analysis that you've given us, but I'm just wondering whether or not there is a deeper problem for the West, particularly taken by Melanie Phillips' recent writings, that the West is busy undermining itself, undermining its own history. And when you have an ideology like jihadism, or even the communist ideology of China, you need to be able to oppose it with a better idea and a better ideology and a better set of belief system. And is it not the case that the West is destroying its own belief system, and in doing so has its ability to fight back?
I 100% agree with that analysis, and I agree with what Melanie Phillips has written about it as well. And we've been at this game for many years. Some of it has actually been instigated from outside, initially by Russia and increasingly by China. But we don't, in some respects, we don't need that encouragement from our enemies outside our countries. We're quite capable of eating ourselves. And I think I would say that the Biden presidency is a classic example of that. You know, and the Obama presidency before that was also a classic example of that. Both of those two presidents have been effectively elected on a mandate of reshaping the United States of America, and reshaping it in a way that is certainly not conducive to internal cohesiveness, nor indeed to maintaining the kind of cultural or ethical cohesiveness of the West, which has been I would say was a very strong element of US influence in the past. And I think we should all be deeply concerned about how that's affecting all of our countries, certainly Britain. I mean, I know better than I know any other country, and Britain is basically being fragmented to a very large extent by these very actions that you speak about.
Yes, yes, a very sobering note to finish. Richard, I want to thank you. I'll just hand you back to David to do the formal thank you, and then we'll wrap it up. David.
Hey, Alan, thank you very much. And Richard, it's a delight and a privilege having you talk to AJA, and particularly about this very topical issue, given your experience and knowledge. And we follow your work very closely, and you have said publicly that you follow ours. So hopefully 1 and 1 can continue to equal 3, and we gain from you, and maybe you can gain just a tiny bit from us as well. Thank you very much, and that's really all from me at this stage.
Okay, thanks, David. Richard, thank you again from me. It's been wonderful having you, and we do enjoy it very much. For people listening on J-Air, you'll be going back to the studio programming in a moment. Just a reminder that we're taking a break from our Wednesday night events because of the Jewish holidays. We will be back on the 6th of October with Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch. For all of our Jewish viewers and listeners, Shana Tova again, and we hope that you have an easy fast on Yom Kippur. So from me, it's goodbye to you all, and we look forward to having you join us again very, very soon. Bye for now.